Very much, everybody, for your contributions. I think that everybody who has had personal experience with community networks can very clearly see the value in it. And for many people, especially in rural areas, the access is the hook that gets them interested into these projects in the first place. And I think the education elements and the ability to have a network that is managed by themselves and that has the values of neutrality and privacy at the forefront, this is something that can be built from this initial hook. And perhaps you need to look at politicians in the same way, that not every politician is like José or myself has had a personal experience with these networks. So in my case, Freifunk was extremely important simply for the formation of my party. We were a small party, started out in 2006, and for a long time in the beginning we didn't have any offices or anything like that, but the possibility to actually meet and plan political activities was usually in shared spaces that were providing internet through Freifunk. And this is kind of the way, having this infrastructure, this community infrastructure, that we were able to form and organize as a political party in the first place. And so again, the ability to access the internet was the primary thing that got us interested, but I think that the other elements developed from there. So I think what we need to try to foster in the politicians who are working on things like the Electronic Communications Code is to build a kind of reflex that whenever they talk about regulation of internet access providers, or whenever they talk about telecoms regulation, that they have in the back of their minds that community networks exist and that they play an important role. And I think this is important for all commons issues, not just for community networks. I see this in copyright all the time, that we have proposals on the table that are written with YouTube and Facebook and Netflix in mind, but they forget that Wikipedia exists, for example. And I think we have the same problem with telecoms regulation, that people only think of Orange and Telefonica when they are writing this legislation. And I think we need narratives, and we need this personal experience to create this reflex in politicians to remember, whenever they are working with these texts, that other models exist, and that at the very least the laws need to allow them to exist, or ideally to actually enable them and foster them. And I think it's worth looking at what other similar areas have done in order to foster this. So for example, the library community is creating personal links with politicians at the local level. So I think something that you could do that maybe also doesn't require you to travel to Brussels in every instance would be to look at who are the members of the European Parliament from your region, and to invite them to visit your project locally, because they usually are there anyway. I also really like this idea that community networks are like organic farming. Well, organic farming is reasonably successful in their policy activities, and they have found ways of actually influencing the policy process, and it might be worth exchanging with them what has worked and what kind of organization is necessary in order to create in the backs of the minds of people who are working on agriculture that an alternative to the traditional grand economic model of agriculture exists. And I think, well, unfortunately, we are still relatively early in this process, but the regulation is being developed at the moment, and this is a big challenge. I mean, for example, the liability rules, they are not sufficient for community networks. They sometimes even incentivize community networks over commercial operators. But I have very little hope at the moment that the liability rules are going to get any better. Rather, we are fighting every day to make sure that they don't get even worse. And so it's a difficult position to start from. I think we have to, in the European Parliament at the moment, at least try to ensure that the e-commerce directive as the framework for liability exemption is preserved, and that at least in principle it is possible to provide a community network or any network without a liability for all the actions of users. And unfortunately, we're still quite far away from the point where we can actually take steps to improve this situation. But my advice to you is really to try to build these personal links, to focus on the narrative at the moment, and to explain to politicians on examples of things that they already know, why this is important to them, why this is important to their constituency. And I think, yes, access numbers at the aggregated level can be part of that, but it's at least as important that every politician knows that, oh, there actually is a community network in my constituency, and they are fulfilling an important purpose, be it that they are working with refugee communities, be it that they are important for the local economy. Different politicians are interested in different things, and not everybody will be convinced by exactly the same arguments. Finally, I would just like to also encourage you to give us concrete advice, just like La Quadrature has already been doing on the Electronic Communications Code, where you think that, well, if you have the time to compare the Parliament position and the Council position, where we should really focus our energy now. I mean, it's, of course, we can lament all the things that we haven't been able to do in the Parliament position, but the thing that we are able to influence right now is to defend the points that are better in the Parliament text than in the Council text, or perhaps even the other way around, who knows. It might happen that at least in the trilogue we can try to preserve those and prioritize the points that are most important to us. And yes, just a word on the European Internet Forum. I mean, of course, this is on the paper and a non-partisan association, but it's very much an industry-led association. And actually, in the European Parliament at the beginning of the term, we were looking at this European Internet Forum with a few colleagues and decided that we want to have something that is truly independent of business interests, and we formed the Digital Agenda Intergroup, and we have members there of pretty much all the different political groups, and I can also invite you to explore if we can do something with this intergroup, perhaps not just on the topic of community networks, but perhaps to have an event on the Telecoms Code that has the community networks at the table. Because one challenge is, of course, also, if you have an event on community networks, well, the people who already know about it and who already know it's important will come, but the people who are working on telecoms in a broader sense may not be at the table in the first place. So I think it's really important, and I would like to help to also get you into the discussions on the Telecoms Code in a broader sense, and perhaps the intergroup would be a good place to do this. So thank you very much for all your contributions. I think, well, we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that this is really part of the policy agenda, and that the narrative, the idea that community networks exist and are important, hopefully in a few years will be in the back of the mind of every politician working on this. Thank you.